All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Bobby Nichelle. I'm an RTD Director and Director for District D and Chair of the Zero Emission Vehicle Ad Hoc Committee meeting. We are convened today to go through our second roundtable, bringing in different subject matter experts and professionals within the sort of broader electrification, fleet transition, public transportation space. I am joined by fellow directors, Director Williams and Director Bouquet, and we are also happy to have from our staff, we have Henry Stoppelkamp, Michael Ford, Fred Worthen, Dave Jensen, as well as our board office staff. And we're also joined by guests, Chuck Ray, Michael King, and Matt Frommer, each of whom will have the opportunity to introduce themselves. Building off of our learnings from our last roundtable, where we had sort of some more general questions for our panelists, as folks may have seen on the agenda, our staff, in order to sort of get the most out of your guys' time and make the most out of everyone's time, had some really sort of more pointed questions on some of the work you all have done to date to really help us as we think through what our process is and what is feasible and what isn't. But just to get us kicked off here, Chuck, why don't we start with you on just a quick intro, what you do, why you're here.
Yeah, absolutely. Pleasure to be here all. My name is Chuck Ray. I hold down the role of Business Development Director at Microgrid Labs. I like to refer to us as MGL because Microgrid Labs kind of pins us on the energy side only. But what we do at MGL is help fleet operators gain clarity about electric vehicles and charging system design that meets the operational requirements of the fleet. So that's really important. We need to think about the vehicles and the charging as a system. It's not one and then the other and just plug compatibility. We call it our fleet assessment and preliminary system design, and its approach that helps filter through the noise of the vendors and the sales pitches so that operators can confidently budget, apply for grants, engage in engineering design and with their utilities and procurement, the whole point being confidently and continue that journey to transition to zero emissions, cost effectively reduce risk. I mean, that's our aim. Now, to do this work, we built our own cloud-based planning platform. We call it EVOpt. Significantly reduces the cost and the time of planning up front, but better yet, because it's a cloud-based system, you can continually update your plans, run different scenarios. Some of the questions are here today. What about EV tariff? What about on-site energy? What about different battery sizes? I think we're seeing the most use of this really in deployments because we're going to put electric buses or hydrogen buses on different routes, and we just want to verify that this still makes sense. So that's the kind of work I do. I'm here. Lynn is my rep. I've run into Lynn recently over the last couple of years, and we've been chatting about, well, I am a heavy rider of the RTD system, so that's one topic. And then I also know Bobby a little bit through work back at RMI. Thank you.
And Chuck, it's probably too modest to say this, but Chuck was also can you share what you did a little bit at RMI, which may be sort of why we asked with transit agencies?
Yeah, absolutely. At RMI, the Zero Emission Mobility Group, we do a lot of work internationally and US, a lot on the global south, and have helped smaller governments deploy fully zero emission buses. So I do have a nice sampling. In India right now with MGL, our founders are Indian, so we're working on a 6,000 bus system in Bangalore. And then I have experience both in South America and the Caribbean. So yes, I am with you guys at this. This is no easy task.
Thanks. Mr. King.
Yes, thank you for inviting me today. My name is Michael King. I work at the Colorado Department of Transportation in our Office of Innovative Mobility. My focus is electrification and energy for the DOT. A couple of things that I spend most of my time on. One of them is working with other state agencies and stakeholders, local governments, private sector, on grant programs for public charging out there across the state. The big thing right now is the federal NEVI program, $57 million for public-facing fast charging across Colorado along our major corridors. Second thing that I do a lot of at CDOT is work on transitioning our own fleet to zero-emission vehicles, starting with the light duty, increasingly looking at the medium and heavy duty. And the holy grail, of course, is Mustang. Can we make Mustang zero emission, and when can we do it, and how can we do it? And then the third thing I do, which is I think the reason I'm here today, I work with our Division of Transit and Rail to support transit agencies in their own fleet transition process, both with the funding that's available, the technical support, helping them make connections and plan for the future. And so I'm very excited to talk with RTD today about where you've been, where you are, and where you'd like to go next, and how the state can support you in that. Thank you.
Thank you. And last but not least, and by the way, please, love for this to be as informal as a public agency roundtable is allowed to be. Matt from SWEEP.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Matt Fromer here from SWEEP. That's the Southwest Energy Efficiency Project. We're a nonprofit based in Colorado, but we work around the Southwest. I work on policy, so transportation, land use, quite a bit on electrification, but also on the VMT production side of things. And yeah, I've been closely tracking the state's attempts to reduce transportation greenhouse gas emissions for the past few years. I also sit on the board for the Clean Transit Enterprise. That's the group set up by Senate Bill 260 to design and disperse funds for electric transit buses. Yeah, overall, just happy to be here and participate in the conversation.
Awesome. Thank you. I want to take a moment to turn it over to our staff. I know we have several members from our senior leadership team on. Before we dive into some of these questions, is there anything you all wanted to sort of share about where RTD is now, sort of help lay out the field of current state of affairs here at RTD with where our current fleet is, or anything of that nature?
Sure, I can help out if you'd like. My name is Fred Worthen. I'm the Assistant General Manager of Bus Operations. I'm managing most of our fleet electrification efforts for RTD. We currently have 36 buses on our BYD buses on our 16th Street Mall fleet. We have 17 other buses at this time that are on order that we have scheduled for delivery later this year. Most of our fleet electrification efforts will be going out to bid for some consulting services a little bit later on this year to help us evaluate the feasibility of converting to other forms of alternative fuels, and to look at our facilities and infrastructure and what would be needed to support some type of alternative fuel system above and beyond our existing fleet. So that's kind of the nutshell where we're at right now.
All right, Mr. Ford, anything to add?
No, I think Mr. Worthen. Hold on. No, I think Mr. Worthen captured the state of where we're at right now, and obviously more discussion needs to be had, but I think he captured just fine. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Yeah, Matt.
Yeah, I mean, it's really exciting to hear that we're finally getting the next batch of electric buses at RTD. I'm just wondering sort of what planning you've done in preparation to receive those buses in terms of the charging infrastructure. You mentioned some of the challenges with the depot, potential upgrades there. So I guess, how are you feeling about receiving those 17 buses and where you are?
Oh, we have a team of individuals that are working, cross-functional team that are working throughout the agency, doing a lot of work. We've been actively engaged with Excel Energy to help with planning for grid and infrastructure. We've we have consulting services available for looking at the fleet. It's the facilities itself. So there's been a lot of work that's been going on for over 2 years now to prepare for the fleet.
Awesome. I'm going to run through. Oh, Director Williams.
Yeah, I have a question for Fred. Where are those buses going to live based on all that work, Fred?
Right now, they are scheduled to be operated out of our East Metro Division.
Hey, works for me.
I'm going to run through some of these. Some are sort of initially directed at individuals, but of course, anyone's welcome to chime in. Starting with Matt, your June 30th, 2020 paper, Colorado Pathways to Reducing Carbon Pollution from the Transportation Sector, said that hard to electrify segments like air travel have to fully shift from petroleum-based fuels to net zero carbon alternatives by no later than mid-century. How do you define those industry segments that are hard to electrify?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think aviation's the one that comes up pretty often because we don't have an obvious electric alternative. Typically like boats, ferries are in that category if you're not in Colorado, maybe on the coast. And then also the long range class 8 freight trucks that are going to be very difficult to electrify. Put a lot of miles on those, get carrying heavy loads. I would say compared to some of those, the electric transit buses are relatively mature. I was looking at some of the numbers from last year, and actually the electric transit bus penetration is higher than that for light duty EVs. So we're actually further along electrifying transit buses than we are for cars as a percentage of the total. I think part of that is like we started early on this. We had generation 1 buses that are 7-8 years old already. And then also there's the potential to lower the operating costs because they're driven so many miles. So you compare it to something like electric school buses, which are great technology in their own right, but driven relatively few miles. And if the operating cost savings is coming on a per mile basis, the business case for transit buses is a little bit better in terms of electrification. So, I mean, I look at the full transportation emissions picture here, and in Colorado, it's the largest emitting sector. We're far behind where we need to be in the 2025, 2030 goals. We need to cut emissions as quickly as possible, kind of wherever we can get them. And right now, I think in 2023, electric transit buses are ready for prime time.
Great. So sort of answering that second question on there, which is those duty cycles for transit buses requiring significantly longer range and infrastructure costs would not be sort of from your position a hard to electrify segment.
Not saying it's easy and the challenges are very real, but the technology is at least available.
Yeah. I saw Chuck next. Go ahead.
Just to add on to what Matt's saying about the maturity of the technology, I did want to bring up this point. You know, we've been here, we've done that, right? With new technology and alternative fuels. The technology often is overpromised and underdeliver. And I think that's some of the things that are hanging us up. But to Matt's point, we are 10 years in to the maturity of this technology now. I think we are approaching 1 million electric buses deployed around the world already. I know that one project we're working on, we're taking delivery of 300 later this spring. And I happen to, based on what I was saying with Bobby and RMI and working the Global South, we do support an LX. And they've been able to deploy 800 buses in under 3 years in Santiago, Chile. I think we're trying to get 600 on the road in Mexico City. And I think they've already got 800 on Bogota. And there are different, cost factors and challenges there. Again, not saying it's easy, but just want to point out that scale is possible. And electric technology is mature. So I think we should be careful if we want to pin all our bets on an unproven technology of hydrogen to really cover these long term. I mean, we're just starting down that path. We only have about 100 hydrogen buses on the road. So, we'll see, right? Because it's going to be the same thing, a little overpromise, a little underdeliver. And it's going to take us some years to work out the kinks, but electric is ready for prime time.
Before I go to Director Williams, I just want to note for the record that we've been joined by Chair Geisinger, who's a member of the ZEB committee, as well as Director Tisdale. Director Williams.
Yeah, I just have a couple of things I want to throw in there. So I'm assuming that all of you guys are familiar with Lightning E-Motors, which is here in our territory, actually. And I'm wondering if anybody's looking at converting, because we have some criteria that we have to meet on buses that we have bought with grant funding, that they have to have so many years or so many miles. And so I'm wondering if there's any options to get around those restrictions by converting buses that we have already.
So Lightning E-Motors does repower existing vehicles, and they also convert vehicles that are essentially off the line from Ford and GM, and they repower them to be electric before they're ever used. My sense, I don't know all the latest from them. I think that their business is moving more in that latter direction of off the line vehicles repowered to electric. For instance, they have an electric transit van that was just, I believe, certified by America and also Altoona tested for the first time. So that's an example of something they offer. In terms of repowering some of your existing RTD vehicles, I know that that's something they can do. They've done it at least once for Boulder, one of the Boulder Hop vehicles. I don't know if they would consider that the best option in terms of cost efficiency, but it's certainly something on the table. And I think Lightning and other companies like that are worth investigating.
Thank you. And I just want to note for the record, I know we have some private sector folks on. I know we've had some private sector folks on before, and certain companies are being mentioned by name. But then just a reminder for everyone that any and all procurement by RTD has to go through a fair and open competitive bid procurement process as a public agency, complying with both our state and federal guidelines. Chuck, has your modeling shown an optimum BEB for those assembled virtually or not deep in the transit world, standing for battery electric bus capacity for garages, given the available Excel rate structure and how microgrids might be able to affect that capacity?
Yeah, let me try to tease that question apart, because I think there's three questions in there, really. And the first one is, where is it viable on battery electric? Like, is there a capacity limit at a specific garage? And we absolutely know from deployments already, the limitation is how many buses can you fit in that garage? I mean, that's the biggest problem that's underway for everybody. And so when we think about electrification, now we have to park them in the right slips or get them to the right location for charging. And that's really the problem with the space, I think, in the garage. When it comes to the electric capacity, there is no capacity that's too much. Consider that your distribution utility, as we like to say in the parlance of electricity space, but the utility is always powering a new division, building a new high rise. They can bring whatever power is necessary. It's a matter of what does that cost for them? Do they pass that through? Do they spread that cost out over time? So there's not a capacity limit theoretically. There is the question around what capacity can they handle today with zero upgrades. In other words, how close am I to my transformer and my substation? How big are those transformers? That is a real question. I think that's where a couple of us have already mentioned planning, and that's where planning can really help, because we need to phase that out. What are we trying to do in the next 5 years? Let's build to that capacity. What does 10 years look like? What does 15 years look like? I bring that up because I think it's real unfair that we've asked transit agencies to figure out what is your zero emission fleet transition plan over the next 20 years. And we know that no plan, especially one that's 20 years out, stands, first contact with reality. So we need adaptable plans that are directional. At MGL, I'll bring that up again. I really like to pursue a no regrets pathway. Like, what can I electrify now with the smallest batteries and the lowest cost chargers? Because we can get started down that path with very low risk. I realize the complexity, increases as we're interweaving zero emission, along the way. So I don't think there's a capacity challenge on the electricity side. And I think, did you ask about demand charges or microgrids, Danny? Which way did we go?
Both and.
Both and?
There's a point, I guess, how do you sort of incorporate, right? Is there a point at which demand charges make it unacceptable?
Mhm.
And how do microgrids alter that analysis?
So I'm doing a little clarity with you guys, not answering the question directly. The demand charge problem is really a public charging problem because it comes down to utilization. Just think about asset utilization. So if you think about a demand charge, it's a fixed cost. So what we want to do is minimize our fixed cost and maximize our throughput. It's no different than how we're running the buses. If we're running a bunch of routes, it's going to cost us the same regardless. If we have no people on those buses, then our cost per person ride or our cost per mile is very high. If we schedule, do our plan well and get more people on the bus, then our cost per head, cost per ride, cost per mile is much less. Exact same thing with electricity. So what we're trying to do is spread out our charging as much as possible and limit our demand. And there are a couple of different strategies to do that. So my point is, it's not the demand charge in and of itself. It's really about how do we manage that charging. So if you only have a few buses, demand charge could be a problem. If you have a lot of buses and you can spread that charging out, which is absolutely possible to meet operations, then you can manage the cost of that electricity. And as an example of that, when Carly was with you guys, Carly Macias, we did take a heavy look at that EV tariff when we were going through the rate making, if you will, with Excel. And we felt like we answered all the questions with the new EV tariff. That EV tariff was trying to solve several different problems at the same time. I'm a fan that fleet charging is actually not as big of a problem as we think it is, and the demand charge is not what stands in the way, quite frankly. And it turns out when we looked at several different tariffs, we would have saved more money on that annual monthly charge. I think you guys were paying on the mall buses something like $18,000 to $22,000 a month, as I recall. You were actually better off staying on your secondary general rate and just managing the charging over those operations. You would have saved about 20% compared to moving over to the new tariff. We just didn't look at all scenarios or both scenarios on every tariff. So managed charging addresses the cost of electricity problem. The infrastructure and the capital cost is a concern. And that's why I was mentioning, how do we phase this out and not take this all up front in one cost? When we talk about microgrids, most of the questions I get is really around the resilience. What level of resilience can I get with some on-site generation? And what does that mean to my operations? But absolutely, if we have a grid constraint that the utility cannot give us an upgrade for 2 or 3 years because of supply chain, which will start to ease, then yes, you can absolutely do, I would say, on-site battery storage to start with, and then however much solar you can get in there, and then obviously take advantage of the nighttime wind and load those batteries up. So again, there's multiple scenarios. It's like, what problem are we trying to solve?
Thanks, Chuck. Director Williams.
Yeah, Mike, we saw some information about solar powered chargers this morning. Can you speak about that a little bit?
Yeah, so there are some products out there for solar powered charging. I think in most cases, they make more sense in the light duty sector than something the size of a bus. We've had proposals over the years to fund those using state grants, and they are considered eligible. In most situations that I've seen, and Chuck and Matt can please disagree with me on this, but in most cases, the cheapest option is to tie to the electrical grid. The sort of solar powered charging makes more sense if you have temporary deployments, say for some sort of public event that you want EV charging at. Or the other case that we're very interested in is things like trailheads and remote parts of Colorado where there is no grid capacity, but there is a need for charging. So in RTD's case, I would not advise you that it's necessarily always a bad idea, but if you're talking about a facility that's going to be charging buses every day for years, I'm not sure that the integrated solar is necessarily going to be the best value. Now, a microgrid like Chuck is discussing is just a much larger version of that same concept. I think potentially makes a lot of sense in a transit agency environment.
Yeah. All right. Start off with Mike. How have you or how do you incorporate the risk of thermal runaway into your assumptions for infrastructure design?
Yeah, so this was an interesting question. To be honest, the DOT has not done a lot of work on infrastructure design. I think this is really perhaps a better question for Chuck or for other transit agencies that have designed facilities. In terms of, for those that are not familiar, thermal runaway refers to this idea that battery electric vehicles have the potential, if there is a fire, that fire becomes sort of self-perpetuating. And so if we zoom out from that specific issue, the general concern that when you have a new technology, a new type of vehicle, it presents different risks from what you're used to as a transit agency dealing today with mostly liquid fuels. How does that look different in the future with other types of technology? At the state, we are very focused on this idea of both workforce development for zero emission vehicles in general, as well as traffic incident management, what we call it at CDOT, crashes out on the road. If you have more zero emission vehicles on the road, they will inevitably, unfortunately, be involved in incidents. And are your first responders, are your systems built to deal with multiple fuel types when for the past 100 or so years, everything has been oriented towards gasoline or perhaps diesel vehicles? Some of the things that we're doing as a state, we're working with the community colleges to provide more zero emission vehicle high voltage training in the automotive technology programs so that our mechanics and technicians are prepared for that. Within CDOT, we're trying to provide as much training as is available on how to deal with firefighting and incident management for our own staff, as well as local first responders. So for instance, we are working with General Motors and NREL to bring a training to Aurora later this month that we're going to be offering to first responders to learn how to safely deal with zero emission vehicles involved in crashes. In the context of RTD, what I think this might translate to is considering the fire suppression systems and the emergency response systems at your facilities, so that if an incident were to occur, your staff are prepared for that, your facility is designed for that. I'm not the person, unfortunately, to speak to the specifics of what that should be, but it's certainly part of the planning consideration in your transition. I'm sure it's something that Fred and his staff are considering or have already dealt with your existing fleet. So I can't speak to the design considerations, but it should definitely be in there, and the state has resources available to help you prepare for that.
Thank you. Director Williams, see you next.
Yeah, I'm wondering, Henry, Fred, do we have any plans to participate in this event in Aurora that Mike is talking about?
I haven't heard of this, sorry.
Mike, is
Yeah.
it possible that we can have our people, since these buses are going to be in the East Metro facility, that you could
Yes.
connect?
Yes, I apologize. I haven't spoken with Fred about this, but I spoke with Bill Weidenar earlier today. And so I think we're going to have at least 4 people from your staff participate. So.
Super. Thank you. And then I have one more, Chair, if I may. Mr. Stoppelkamp, do you have any input or questions in any of this as our facility guy? Henry?
From time to time, I think our staff are, going to come in and respond or ask questions when they have them to ask. I think, right?
Okay.
My understanding is they're primarily focused on listening and learning from our.
Mr. Ford, anything you want to put in at this point?
Not at this point, but we will tag into this training or this opportunity to get more information. So that's the first I had heard about it. So we'll follow up.
All right. Anyone else want to weigh in on thermal runaway and design? So,
Bobby, I'll jump in without raising my hand. There is a topic underway with the APTA Zero Emission Committee. So we can pay attention in there and see what's been contributed. I know I haven't tuned into that specific topic, but it is underway in the industry.
Thanks. Colorado Electric Vehicle Plan, which was originally created as part of an executive order, targets a straight line adoption rate for transit vehicles in Colorado from effectively 0%, except for RTDs for 2020, like RTDs BEV free ball ride vehicles to 100% in 2050. Do you consider this plan to be realistic? I think thinking about public dollars that are available, and sort of B, infrastructure, and C, actually, is the tech there to run those blocks, whether those are the CDOT West that goes from Union Station to Grand Junction and back, or for RTD, I think, Fred, I don't remember what our longest block is, but I know it's long, a few hundred miles. So sort of where our heads at on that, and I know Matt and you probably have some good info there as well.
Yeah, so I think Chuck already made reference to the fact that planning for 20 years in the future, let alone 30 years at the time of this plan, it's a dicey proposition, right? So, however, the demands of the climate crisis sort of require that we think in these terms about 2050 timelines. When the 2020 EV plan was written, you're correct that RTD had 36 small ride shuttles in service. At the time, Boulder, Rafta, and Breckenridge, I believe, also had smaller deployments, several vehicles. And there were a number of other transit agencies that were in the stage of procurement or planning. Today, we have about 71 vehicles, battery electric buses, operational in Colorado. We have another 43 that have been awarded and are in some stage of procurement. So there is progress since that 2020 plan towards the goal of 1,000 by 2030 and 100% zero emission by 2050. But of course, I can't say whether that goal will be accomplished, whether that target will be accomplished, because the technology is really changing. And there are a lot of sectors, there are a lot of routes, as well as vehicle types, where there is not yet a viable ZEV option that we can plug into the existing system. But what we're doing is trying to make that target achievable through the state programs, the incentives, the regulations, the technical support, everything that we're doing to bend that so that it does become feasible. So for instance, the Clean Transit Enterprise was mentioned. That was passed as part of Senate Bill 260. The first 10 years of that enterprise has an estimated $134 million worth of funds that we'll be able to invest in planning, vehicles, infrastructure, and facilities, all of which will be necessary to make this possible. Just last Friday, the federal government, the FTA, Federal Transit Administration, released their 5339 grant programs for the year, $1.6 billion available nationally in there. Last year, Colorado was able to secure about $50 million through that program for our state. So, between those things and the hopefully ongoing decline of the price of the vehicles over the longer term, the continued advances in the battery technology, as well as potentially the advent of cost-effective hydrogen as an option in addition to battery electric, we think that this is achievable, but there are a lot of factors that are out of our control that we need to work on. In terms of the number of vehicles in the state, in the transit fleet, as well as the timelines for replacing those that are just sort of the normal replacement timelines, we have the time to do it in terms of the life of the vehicles. But the question is always down to, at the time you're going to replace that vehicle, is there a viable ZEV option? And if there isn't at that time, you might be waiting another 10 to 15 years until you get another chance to replace it. So we're trying to address as many of the financial and technical barriers as possible, but a lot of it is dependent on the industry, the technology, the cost, things that as a state we can't directly influence.
Yeah. Director Williams, I'm going to go to our panelists first. Matt, go ahead.
Sure. I mean, that's about as good as answer you're going to get. But I just wanted to bring up sort of the policy landscape outside Colorado. We have seen in the past couple decades that California's policies really do drive vehicle electrification. In terms of whether it's low emissions vehicles like hybrids, zero emission vehicles like light duty EVs, and similarly with buses and medium heavy duty vehicles. They do have a rule on the books called the Innovative Clean Transit Rule, which basically requires transit agencies to buy a percentage of to buy electric vehicles, and that percentage increases each year. So for 2025, it's 25%, 2026 through 2028, it's 50% of new vehicles need to be electric. And then by 2029, 100% of new buses purchased by California transit agencies needs to be zero emission. And those are the types of policies that really drive innovation, because California is so big and because the market tends to respond. So I think they're really going to push that, specifically when it comes to the long range vehicles that we're really worried about, like that last 10, 20% of electrification. And then when you think about working backwards from 2050 with this goal, really the late 2030s is when we need to get to like 100% of new vehicles being electric. I feel pretty comfortable with that runway. I mean, it's daunting from where we are now, but it seems possible.
And Matt, do you know in California, are there technical assistance programs that are provided, or either in-kind or reduced cost, or funding that's made available to public agencies to help them get there from the state level or municipal level?
Yeah, I mean, they have stacked quite a few incentives. The biggest one, I think, is the HVIP program, which we kind of use to model one of the SB 260 grant programs, the Clean Transit Enterprise Grant. So Colorado's working toward that, and we're learning a lot from what California's been doing in recent years to design our electric bus grant programs. They also, I noticed on the agenda, you had the low carbon fuel standard or the clean fuel standard, something California has, Oregon, Washington. And yeah, policy that SWEEP is definitely interested in. CO did a feasibility analysis a couple of years ago looking at the clean fuel standard. And I think it's on the table, though not one of like sort of the near-term action items. But it is one of those things that sort of assesses a fee on pollution and then uses the revenue to subsidize the transition to clean technology. Worth considering for sure.
Awesome. Chuck?
Yeah, I wanted to add on to something Michael stated, really around the funding that's available now. So in the past, we've had technology obstacles. We're rapidly working through those. We can't get hung up on the 3 to 6, black eyes or failed deployments when we have over 1,000 electric transit buses deployed in the US and another 2,000 on the way over the next year or two. That's the technical side. Matt's hitting on the policy drivers. Funding, the state's willing to fund these projects. The federal government has come forward to fund these projects. Under the FAST Act for the last, whatever that was, 5 to 8 years, under the low-no and the 5339, at least on the bus side, that was slated as $55 million a year. They had been able to come through over the last couple of years at $180 million. We have stepped forward under the Infrastructure Investment Job Act, 10x, $1.8 billion for transit, zero emission or low-no emissions over the next 5 years. We don't know if that money is going to be available in the future. So I would just recommend or really push us to get our fair share of that funding.
Yeah, and I would agree with that, but I think I would also say that $55 million a year is probably only about 50 buses a year. 1.6 or 1.8 billion a year is awesome, but again, you're talking about 1,500 buses-ish, right? 1,200 to 1,500 buses. And I do not know with 100% confidence, but we at RTD may have few hundred. I think there's probably, that's not even one state's worth of buses. So yes, there's money out there, but my understanding from the policy side is we're still short. Is that a fair assumption that yes, there's money out there? Yes, we want our fair share, but it isn't quite there yet there's not enough money there yet that we can really be going one-to-one without putting other services at risk. Is that sort of a fair picture?
Well, I think it's fair to say that the amount of money currently anticipated at the state and nationally is not enough for every project in the country or in the state. One of the things that is an unknown, but that there has been a long-term trend, is that the price of the buses and the batteries themselves is declining over time. Now, the last few years, we haven't seen that. It remains to be determined, how much of that is inflation, the pandemic, et cetera. But the idea would be that if the money available today is not enough for a full transition, that the price, the incremental cost difference between your diesel for diesel replacement and your diesel for battery, electric, or hydrogen eventually decreases or becomes zero, so that it's not as big of a barrier. To Chuck's point, the federal funding is around for about 5 years. After that, we're not sure. So there is an incentive to try to grab as much of it as you can in the short term. The state funding, the Clean Transit Enterprise, does not sunset in the statute. So the $134 million that I referenced is for the first decade. As long as that remains in statute, it will continue collecting the retail delivery fee, and it will continue having funds for projects. So don't assume that there's a cutoff at 134 there. But yes, there is not enough money for every single project in the country right now. That is in some ways an incentive to move quickly before other transit agencies can do the same, given RTD's deeper experience with battery electric buses. I think you're well positioned to get a lot of that money, but it's also the case, hopefully, we anticipate the prices will become less of a barrier over time, because that incremental cost will decrease or go to zero.
Awesome, thank you. Director Williams, I think I saw your hand up earlier. Did you have something else?
Yeah, I one of the things that I don't hear at all in this discussion, I brought up earlier, which is we have some criteria that we have to do something with buses that we have. And so what happens, and I don't know, Mike, throughout the state, to the buses that people are proposing to replace, or do you just add to your fleet continually?
So in most cases, I think that transit agencies prefer to acquire a new zero emission bus when they are about to retire an existing vehicle. Some previous grant programs had a scrappage requirement that you had to physically destroy the other vehicle so that it could not be used again. The Clean Transit Enterprise is not proposing to have that as a requirement. So if you had existing vehicles that had reached the end of their useful life, you could dispose of them, or you could sell them, or you could donate them, whatever you want to do. You would not be required to scrap them. In some cases, there are a few fleets around the state that are attempting to go zero emission even before their existing vehicles reach the end of their useful life, which of course is not as clear cut of an economic proposition for some agencies to have that option. Yeah, that would be based on what RTD prefers to do. I don't know if you would necessarily choose to expand your fleet, because you'd probably be replacing the oldest, dirtiest vehicles with these new vehicles.
Yeah, Matt.
Yeah, so I just want to jump in and maybe take a step back and talk about the big picture climate implications. And there's a study that CDOT put out a couple of years ago, a cost benefit analysis on their greenhouse gas planning standard, that basically lays out a scenario to cut emissions by 1.5 million metric tons, which is the goal of that rule. In fact, I cite this analysis so often that a coworker made me a mug that literally has the greenhouse gas cost benefit analysis on it. So yeah, probably a broken record on this, but I don't talk to you guys that often. But basically what the analysis says is that as a state, we need to increase transit service by about 6% annually between now and 2030 if we have any shot of cutting emissions and hitting the target. I know that's purely hypothetical at this point since RTD doesn't have funding to increase service at those levels. But I think it's the goal of this administration to hit our statutory climate targets, and doing so will require a significant increase in transit service and ridership. They also sort of backed those transit service assumptions into some sort of assumption around how many new buses we would need. And it's between 1,000 and 2,000 statewide. I assume RTD is probably half that. So I imagine we're going to have a use for these buses if we can find the money to support more service. And again, as a way to hit our climate targets.
Great. Director Williams?
Sorry, me again. And where are we going to put those 1,000 buses? Mr. Ford, Mr. Worthen, Mr. Stoppelkamp?
Resuming call.
I can say that our facilities that we have out there are 40 plus years old, purpose designed for a diesel fleet. Our lifts aren't designed for the heavier buses, access to the batteries on the roof. So redesign facilities, but we will need additional facilities, and it will also depend on the blocks and the routes that the buses are assigned. Do we go with a bunch of smaller facilities, or do we continue with the 200-300 bus facilities across the district? And that's one of the things that the transition plan that we've been talking about will have to address. But Director Williams, you're absolutely right. If we're going to replace our 1,000 buses we have, we are going to have to need new facilities to accommodate those buses.
It's just my issue is that it's great to talk about electric vehicles, but we need to talk about not only how we're going to charge them, where we're going to charge them, where we're going to store them, what we're going to do with the buses that we are replacing. And if we're not replacing any, where we're going to park them all. I mean, the picture is bigger than just great. RTD should go out and apply for some funding and get some NOLO funding and get some new electric vehicles. If we're going to do our due diligence in my role, Director Geisinger and Bouquet and Deschelle, we need to look at the whole big picture. I'm sorry. Okay, Mike, go ahead. You're up.
Oh, I agree with that sentiment completely. It is very important to develop a transition plan that considers every element of this. And that will, I think, guide your grant pursuit at the federal and state level. It will tell you what sort of support you need, including facilities, as Mr. Stoppelkamp referenced. That's something that in the design of the Clean Transit Enterprise, it was very strongly communicated that facility modifications need to be part of what is eligible, as is planning. Planning needs to be an eligible expense because transit agencies cannot successfully do this without a plan. And oftentimes that plan will indicate that beyond the vehicles and the chargers, the facilities themselves need to be modified or addressed. I've already referenced the workforce development element that's there. There is a budgeting element. There is a communications element. Every part of your organization is likely to be impacted, and having a plan that lays that all out in advance, I think is critical for any transit agency, especially one as large as RTD.
And just a quick follow-up, I want to make sure I heard you correctly, which is the 134 million is not just for buses, right? We could apply theoretically, and I know everyone has to go through an application process, fair, and you have evaluation criteria, but theoretically, if we need facility modifications or we need a new ground up facility because retrofitting the one we have doesn't work, that 134 million is eligible for that type of use. Is that?
Yes, for planning vehicles, charging or fueling, and facilities are all considered eligible. And then likewise, at the federal level, the 5339, I don't know specifically if planning is called out, but the other three are definitely included in 5339. And the other reminder, of course, is that the Clean Transit Enterprise, the 5339, these are examples of grants that are specific to zero emission buses. But every other transit grant that CDOT has at the state level or that the federal government offers do not exclude zero emission buses. So anything that you're using today can likely, I can't say 100%, I'd have to check that, but can likely be applied to this purpose as well. It's not just the things that are reserved for ZEBs. It's those plus everything else.
Great. Chuck?
Yeah, absolutely. Just following on the funding question, it's come up about 3 times, I think, in our conversation already. We also have a new opportunity here to consider public-private partnerships, third-party services. There is a ton of private money sitting on the sidelines looking for projects to invest in that are climate tech, number one, but zero emission transportation, absolutely. So I realize transition plan is in place, but we also need to challenge ourselves or open the door to step outside of being totally dependent on grants and look at these other opportunities where we can leverage private capital. It does 2 things. It doesn't just fund what we need potentially in facilities, charging infrastructure, et cetera. It also takes a lot of the risk off of our hands as the operator and puts it on that third-party private company that's doing the same work for many different facilities across the country. So let's just, when we get to that point, let's make sure we stay open to private money coming in the form of public-private partnerships.
Yeah. So Chuck, along those lines, as you and others may know, RTD is required by state statute to deliver a certain percentage of service by private contract. What sort of in the collective opinion related to that P3 public-private partnership discussion is the best way to sort of facilitate electrification of a contract service, recognizing, right, we don't own the facilities, may not own the vehicles. So how do we address that element as we look forward?
Well, I can start off. This is an area that I'm actually very interested in learning more about, and especially RTD's contractor relationship. But we're aware, of course, that there are multiple transit agencies in the state that contract some portion of their service. In many cases, I believe that is restricted to operators, but in some cases, it also includes facilities or vehicles. From the state perspective, a lot of our grant programs are really designed for transit agencies or local governments. And so to this point, I've been hoping that in this coming year, 2023, we can start the conversation about, are there ways that our resources can or should be made available to these private companies that are doing the contracted service, or are there other ways that we can support them? Even just starting with understanding what are their own goals, what is their experience in other parts of the country? Are your existing contractors already planning for this change? Do they see this as part of their future or even their competitive advantage over other companies in the future? And once we understand that landscape, looking at the different options for, can future procurements include this consideration as a preferred offering of a contractor? Are there other things that we can do? So I'll be the first to admit, I don't fully understand the current landscape of contracted transit service in Colorado, but I think it is something that we need to look at, because if these companies are willing and able to do some of this lift for RTD and other transit agencies, we should be taking as much advantage of that as we can to accelerate the process and de-risk it for public entities, as Chuck referenced.
Mr. Ford or anyone on your team, would you guys be, I know it's a bit off the cuff, but just sort of able to provide a current state of affairs of RTD's contracted services, sort of 30,000 foot view?
Yeah, right now we have a requirement about 56% to 58% of our service would be contracted out on the fixed route side. That is something we've continue to address every service change depending on what resources we have available. And those contracts are First Transit and Transit. I think the names have changed now. Fred, you can update that at this point. And then we also have our paratransit contracts, but I'll defer to you to give more detail on that.
Yeah, we currently have 4 fixed route facilities that are contract operated. And we also have 3 other facilities that we have accessoride and flex ride facilities out of. Overall, we have about 1,000 vehicles between the fixed route and the paratransit realm that are contract operated itself. So we are talking about a massive effort here with all the different facilities throughout the region that we have at this point. And even in those cases, the contractors only own a couple of the facilities. The rest of them are leased properties. The only 2 that are owned are the Denver property and the South Denver property by Transdev and First Transit. The remainder are all contract leased.
Thanks, Brad. And I do want to remind folks that RTD also operates light and commuter rail. Currently, those services are all electrified. Hopefully keep that way, but that is, for the record, we do also operate rail, and the committee has discussed that zero emission vehicle means all vehicles that are capable of electrification. So those are including our, normal cars, vehicles that may operate at our various facilities, and looking at electrification really broadly from a climate perspective. I think we sort of need all of that there. A shorter question, hopefully, and just try to shift up the pace here. Which large transit agencies do you consider to be doing the best at electrifying their fleet? When we say large transit system, we mean one that operates at least 100 buses in an annual maximum service in an urbanized area with a population of at least 200,000. So that's what we mean when we say large. I don't expect you all to go start running those numbers, but generally speaking, who's doing well on the large transit agency side? And you can say no. If the answer is no one, that's fine too.
Well, yeah,
Chuck,
I might defer to Chuck on this one, actually.
No, that's far too much pressure. I'm going to go to one that's very familiar because we work on this project, is King County Metro. I think they're almost exactly the same size as Denver's RTD, as you all are. They are, well, they're in Washington State, so they really are considering, can I do the entire thing with electric? One of the things we're doing for them is designing the entire block schedule around the capabilities of electric to see what it tells us. Also to identify where does on-route charging make sense, where does other facilities make sense. If we look at, we're not trying to come up with a new schedule or a new service plan at all, but we're trying to look at both sides of that conversation. And I will say for the first 26 buses, they do really see this as a trial, not unlike the mall ride. I think you guys have been operating the mall ride for more than 5 years, maybe 7 by now. I think they're doing a really good job. We obviously have to, and they have the placement challenge, right? Like, what is our pull in, pull out? Where are we charging? They've kind of made all those decisions, and they're using several different charging. They are going with overhead pantograph on everything, which makes sense, for tight spaces. But they are looking at new facilities as well. I think as all the large agencies are, it turns out to be really challenging to retrofit an old facility, especially if it's not structurally sound for the things we need to do with electrification. Obviously, we have to look West Coast. California, a lot of the agencies out there have really been working on this challenge for a long time, and have been able to get all the way to zero emissions. I can't help but look right in our backyard, which is right at that threshold of small, which is RAFTA, Roaring Fork Transit Authority. And they have a really interesting service route. They're on the highways with some long hauls, and they're running in the mountains, et cetera. They are looking at multiple fuels. And they're willing to, kind of figure it out. And the planner, in this case is on top of it and really figure out what works. One of the things they find out is, other than the challenges of planning the service, is that the drivers, I mean, you guys know the drivers really like it. The riders love it. I have to say, as a rider / person that may be grabbing a coffee and I'm still on a telephone call, I love it every time an electric bus comes by in my area, because I can continue my conversation. You're kind of blown away when you don't. It's kind of like our pushback with smoking in public places. It's like, no way, nobody's gonna like it. And then once you get rid of it, you're like, oh my gosh, this is an amazing environment. And I feel like it's the same way with electric vehicles. I'm going on a tangent there, but I mean, the benefits are beyond the quantitative. There's a whole qualitative side. And I think once the momentum starts and we're going through the hard work, we all become fans.
Great. Chair, do you mind if I go to our panelists first?
Nope, not at all.
Yeah, just the two quick examples I was going to bring up. One was a grant last year awarded to LA Metro, $104 million from Lono for the purchase of 160 new battery electric buses, and they're moving ahead pretty quickly in LA. And then this is not a large agency, but I'm reminded of Summit County, and they're a $35 million grant from the FTA to build an electric bus depot. And I just encourage other transit agencies in the state to connect with Summit County and talk about the design of that depot and some of the planning they're doing to upgrade facilities and charge those vehicles.
Yeah. Chair?
Thank you. I was in that regard, in terms of other agencies, I was interested in your comments, Chuck, about the public-private partnerships and private investment. Have you seen other agencies that are making those deals in any kind of significant numbers at this point?
Sorry, my screen is popping around. My face is popping around on the screen. I don't know of one offhand. Where I'm coming from on this topic is that I have sat with a number of agencies who are entertaining pitches, if you will, from third-party turnkey, charging as a service, infrastructure as a service, fleet as a service, whatever as a service you want to call it. Our challenge is that we don't know how to assess whether that's a good deal or a bad deal.
Okay.
Because that's not how we purchase. It does not fit in our accounting system. So it's something that, and work with CDOT, we can probably figure out how to overcome this. I'm trying to work out on the transit side to script into those RFIs, a per unit charge, not just what does the whole package cost me, but give me something I can compare to my existing operational costs. And then I have a better chance to understand how to move forward and how to fund. And that is something, let me also bring up, this is probably really important for Mike King, the Colorado Green Bank Clean Energy Accelerator, I think we call it, I'm not sure the acronym. They're very interested in addressing this problem and figuring out replicable financial vehicles that they can distribute to other fleet operators in the state. So this is another one that we're not solved yet, but we do have state agency and support to really figure this out and make sure we have bankable projects that benefit us financially and, remove the risk, because you guys have the really hard work to do, which is delivering service.
Thank you.
Thank you. Director Williams.
Yeah, Mike, my understanding is that CDOT is looking at facilities for their electrified fleet. And I'm wondering if we can't talk together. I mean, Commerce City is in RTD's territory. And so if you're looking to build a facility there, we should talk.
I mean, so right now, a lot of what our attention is on is the light duty charging for our state fleet. And we are attempting to retrofit 22 locations across the state to support charging for the Ford F-150 Lightning electric pickup trucks, which is a very small challenge compared to what RTD does. And even that we are finding is extremely difficult because of the age of the buildings, the remoteness of the facilities, and we're only starting with a small number of light duty vehicles. So this is definitely something that CDOT is in a bit of a unique position in the sense that we are attempting to fund and support other agencies in their electrification efforts, and we are also attempting to do it ourselves. And that experience informs, hopefully, positively, the way that we develop grant programs and other support. In terms of CDOT's heavy duty fleet, including Mustang, this year we are planning to begin our own fleet transition planning, both for the medium and heavy duty CDOT vehicles, as well as the CDOT transit vehicles, Mustang, Pegasus, and Outrider. We recognize that this is going to be a very long process. These are very challenging applications, but we want to start the planning now, as Chuck referenced before, develop kind of nimble, flexible plans that we can adapt and refine over time. And there are, again, to Chuck's point about private investment, when it comes to hydrogen fueling and other innovative sort of fuel types or systems, there are some discussions going on with private companies about, is there a potential for some sort of shared pilot among multiple public agencies? How do we get these new technologies off the ground? So that's definitely something that if RTD is interested in participating in those, we'd be happy to pull you in. The last thing I'll mention about some of what Chuck said, I recently saw that in Detroit, the utility out there got approval for another sort of innovative approach to financing of electric transit vehicle batteries, where the utility would actually own those batteries. The transit fleets would potentially run, they would run the service, they would use those vehicles, but it would again decrease that upfront cost, de-risk it for the agency. This is a model that I think exists in other parts of the country. I'm not sure if it's been applied as directly to transit before this, but another possibility for innovation is working with Xcel and other electric utilities. Is this feasible in Colorado? Would a green bank or a private company be a better fit for that? But as I think Matt said earlier, thinking beyond just the idea that every bus needs to be purchased and owned by RTD. Does that make sense in every case? Are there new possibilities raised by these new technologies? Putting it all on the table, again, I'll put the plug in, doing that transition plan, thinking through all the angles, and then moving forward with a really cohesive approach that ties all of your grant pursuit and your policies to the way that you actually need to serve your customers, rather than just assuming that you can take a battery electric bus, plug it in where a diesel bus is, and nothing else is going to change. We know that's not true. So it's worth thinking through everything first and then acting boldly when you have that plan.
Awesome, thank you. And I think the short answer to your question is yes, absolutely. We'd love to be a part of the discussion around shared facilities. I think on the board side, those of us on here and on the staff side, I think Michael Ford will defer to you and Henry and your team on who you want on that, and we can follow up offline about those further discussions. I'm going to put the next question up and share my screen. It's question 7 because it's longer and it's a lot of information to retain just from me talking. Okay. I'm screen sharing. Fantastic. Can you see the text? Great.
Yes.
Alameda Contra Costa Transit, AC Transit, is a large transit agency in the Bay Area, has conducted, in collaboration with Stanford University's Precourt Institute for Energy, a zero-emission transit bus technology analysis as part of its mission to achieve 100% zero-emission bus fleet before 2040. The study presents a comprehensive comparison of different bus technologies, and the study found that the BEB's cost per mile were lower than those of diesel-fueled buses only when the state of California's low carbon fuel standard credits were taken into account. Do you foresee Colorado providing similar credits in the future?
So I believe Matt actually already touched on this earlier, that there was an analysis of this back in 2020. I'm happy to share the link to that if anyone hasn't had the chance to look at it before. What it found was that the low carbon fuel standard in Colorado would be technically feasible, but there were questions about the administrative burden that it would create and whether that trade-off was worth it in terms of the anticipated greenhouse gas reduction benefits. I think there was also some concern in there about whether it would direct investment actually away from electric and hydrogen and towards things like biofuels, which has other implications for the state. So I would be happy to share that link if folks would like to dig in. To my knowledge, there is not currently any proposal on the table to move forward with a low carbon fuel standard, but it hasn't been completely written off either. It's just sort of the study is completed, the findings are there, and that's as much as I know about it at the moment.
Great. Yeah, that'd be great. Yeah, if you could share that link, Matt.
Yeah, I also can't say for sure whether Colorado will pursue the LCFS. I think it may be on the table as the state goes to update our greenhouse gas pollution reduction roadmap, the version 2.0 this year, since we're so far behind on the transportation greenhouse gas reduction targets. The other thing I was just going to mention was I'm really looking forward to seeing the fuel cost comparison for the new battery electric buses that RTD will be receiving later this year. It's a much more advanced and more energy efficient technology than the mall ride buses. I think I was noticing in your slide deck that the mall ride buses get about 11 or 12 miles per gallon equivalent, whereas the new electric buses that from New Flyer that RTD is receiving will get in the sort of 20 to 25 mile per gallon equivalent range. So twice as energy efficient, meaning you can drive twice as many miles with the same energy and theoretically spend half as much on fuel. So I think it'll be interesting to see what the operating cost comparison will be with this new generation of more advanced bus technology.
Mr. Chairman, can you hear me?
I can, yes, please proceed.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to add a footnote to the discussion about the Alameda Contra Costa Transit Agency, AC Trans, up in the Oakland, San Francisco Bay Area. They will be presenting at our next APTA Transit Board Members Committee Board Talk Live session that we're going to have on Thursday, March 4 at I believe it's 1 o'clock our time, Mountain Time, on transition to electrification and discussing in detail the AC Transit experience. So if you'd like to make a note on your calendar for Thursday, March 2 at 1 o'clock, you'll be able to hear directly from the chairman of the board of AC Transit. And I think he's going to have their general manager, CEO on as well, and perhaps a couple of other people. So I just thought it was appropriate to bring that to your attention now as we were discussing AC Transit. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, it would be great to see that at the very least. Do you know if it will be recorded and a recording will be made available?
The presentation portion of Board Talk Live is recorded and made available to Transit Board members. The Q&A that we have following that is not, because we want to create a safe place for people to discuss things without having their words used against them in another context. So the presentation portion that Joel's putting together will be available, but not the Q&A.
Great, thank you. All right. we have about 12 minutes left. I think one question I want to ask, it's a question I've been asked as well, which is that the EPA data shows that public transit in this area is actually not a meaningful contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. And so as we evaluate public funds and being good stewards of public funds, is there value when making recommendations to spend tax dollars, recognizing that, and Matt, I think your 2020 paper showed similarly, 0% contribution by buses to GHG emissions, that, one BEV can seat 36 passengers and cost 1.1 million, which could also buy 37 Chevy Bolts. So as we, as good stewards of public funds, are evaluating what makes the most sense to actually really get at reducing carbon emissions, recognizing there's a limited amount of dollars, how would you all think we should weigh that? And is electrification or hydrogen or insert other fuel standard, should that be the priority? Or should we really be looking at capital investments that allow us to deliver more frequent service, recognizing how small relatively that GHG emission really is coming out of bus tailpipes? Yeah, Michael, go ahead.
So something that I always preface my conversations with transit agencies around this topic is that the number one priority for a transit agency, in my view, should be to deliver quality, reliable, safe service to the customers. And that electrification of that service or transition of that service to an alternative fuel vehicle is great, but it should never prevent that core mission of safe, reliable, consistent service. So with that said, I think that if it boils down to a choice, I don't think that there's a lot of debate to be had there, but I think that the situation in terms of GHG reduction as a state, as a country, as a planet, we often don't have the choice. It's sort of all of the above. We need to do everything better. And that's very challenging on a day-to-day basis and for organizations, but I think it is both. The other thing to consider, Chuck made reference to the sort of quality of experience difference. There are a lot of folks who, if they are going to experience the benefits of zero emission mobility, both the experience itself as well as the improved air quality, the quieter operation, they're not going to do it in a personally owned Tesla. Their exposure to zero emission transportation will be on a bus. And so if we can provide that to as many people as possible, I think that that is an important goal, that this does not become an issue of equity between those who have access to zero emission transportation and those who do not. So that's not an easy answer. I think every organization has to decide how to spend its limited resources in the most efficient way. But as a state, our goal is that everyone has access to this, and that we do both things. We increase transit, we increase reliability, we improve the experience, and we go zero emission. And how individual agencies choose to get there is up to them, and we're here to support you however you choose to proceed.
Well, I hope we can all get there together. Matt.
Yeah, had I known Mike was going to say that so eloquently, I wouldn't have raised my hand. But yeah, all of that. I think it's a all of the above approach. I mean, in the scenario you gave, right? Should we fund one electric bus at 37 volts? We are doing both, right? We have one of the most generous state EV tax credits in the country, and anyone who buys an EV is eligible for that money. So we are doing both. I would just, encourage RTU to think about the full picture in terms of transportation emissions, not just their own emissions. We could zero out RTD's emissions and still, we wouldn't solve the climate crisis, right? It's just a fraction of the total transportation emissions. And so we need to think about electrification. We need to think about increasing service. We need to think about transit-oriented development and land use. And even if people aren't on the bus, maybe they live near a transit station, there's mixed use density and they can walk around and they're not driving. So I think RTD has a role to play much more holistically in our pursuit of transportation decarbonization.
Awesome. Thanks, Chuck.
Yeah, absolutely. Playing off of what Matt and Mike are saying, I have worked on the EV adoption side of this game a few years back, and it became very apparent to me that the signaling that takes place when the state is running electric F-150s, RTDs running electric buses, if I see my police cars. So in other words, if I'm a consumer, if electric is good enough for CDOT, RTD, or I'm in Boulder, my local muni, then it must be good enough for me. So I think the signaling aspect of this is incredibly powerful.
Thank you. We have a few minutes left. I just want to see if anyone, staff, directors, panelists, if anyone has any closing remarks. Feel free to raise your virtual hand or your normal hand. Looking at I can see everyone on my screen. Yeah, Chuck.
I know you didn't post your question to me, but over time, I mentioned it up front, where we've asked transit operators and many others, corporations actually are quite taking the lead, and states and federal following with their commitments to decarbonization of all forms. But rather than, when is the fleet going to be zero emission is how we've often driven this. I think that's the wrong construct. What we really need to be thinking about is, when are we going to buy our last fossil fuel bus or car? That's really the goal, because anything else is locking in emissions. So if we can achieve that, we'll get to the long-term goal. So I just wanted to offer that up.
Thank you. Any other closing? Yeah, Chair.
Just to say thanks very much. I've learned a lot. This was a really interesting panel, and I appreciate you coming and all your work. Thanks.
Director McKay?
I actually give the floor to Chuck. I'd like to hear more if he has any.
Chuck?
I'm not sure who that is that's raising the hand. I don't know why I'm on here twice.
You got a leftover hand there.
Well, if the other Chuck Ray would like to come off mute, by all means. Otherwise, Director McKay, the floor is yours.
My comment was just going off of Director Geisinger's. Just wanted to thank you guys, Chuck, Michael, and Matt. This is very informative, and although I was a little quiet, I did take a lot of notes for our next session for us to discuss ultimately as an ad hoc committee. Big thing that I'm going to say, because I know staff will probably be, watching this recording or listening as currently live. Big thing I'm walking away is aggression as an agency when it comes down to looking for funds to ultimately move forward with these projects. That's the big thing that is coming down and taken away, is you got to find the funds when it comes down to it. Again, is it the idea of just looking for the facility itself? That was a big indicator for me. And there's a lot of other side notes that we'll talk during our last session, but this was very informative. I just wanted to thank the three of you for being there, but yeah, a lot to think about.
Thank you. Matt?
Yeah, I was going to put in a plug one more time for the Clean Transit Enterprise set up by Senate Bill 260. We did publish a 10-year plan last year, and it kind of maps out roughly how we plan to disperse the grants among the 4 categories. And again, that was like for the vehicle replacement, for the charging infrastructure, for the facilities upgrades, and then perhaps most importantly in the near term for the planning, for the fleet electrification planning. So I'd encourage you to Google the Clean Transit Enterprise 10-year plan. It's a beautiful document. Kudos to CDOT for all the graphics. And yeah, let us know if you have any follow-up questions about the CTE grants.
Thank you. And Chair, your hand is up. I don't know if that's an old hand. No worries. Yes, Michael.
Yeah, so appreciate Matt plugging the Clean Transit Enterprise. I will do the same. You know, we're anticipating that the first round of applications for those funds will be opening in the spring. As I mentioned, we're planning the first 10 years in that 10-year plan, and then, you know, beyond that. But both in the Clean Transit Enterprise and in general in the way that CDOT is trying to support transit agencies, this is an iterative process. There are things in the Clean Transit Enterprise that were included as a direct response to the feedback we got on the Volkswagen settlement, the feedback we got on previous programs. We heard from transit agencies in the past that they were not successful in applying for grants because they couldn't write a plan. We created a grant program to help people write plans. If there is something that RTD is running into that is a barrier for you, let us know and we will work on removing that barrier. That's the goal of the state, is to understand what our customers need and then help them get there. So the Clean Transit Enterprise is a great example of that, but in general, our door is always open. Please let us know how we can help because we're all invested in your success.
Thank you so much. Chuck? Oh no, the fake Chuck Ray is back. No worries. It's 4:30 on the dot. This committee is next scheduled to meet sometime in early March, where we'll be reviewing the scope of work that staff is preparing for our fleet transition plan. I want to thank everyone for joining us, and thank you all for being here. We truly appreciate the community support, your willingness to give your time. Should you have any other thoughts, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. Otherwise, thank you again. We truly appreciate it. And we are adjourned as of 4:30 p.m. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks for doing this.